What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking up with Thor, the God of Hammer storyline, which has just concluded, so we're going to keep this going for the next about 6 weeks or so. One episode each week, right? We'll do this, what is today, Wednesday? This was supposed to go out yesterday on Tuesday, but the Miss Marvel trailer dropped, so we ended up doing that instead. So, from Tuesdays going forward is when we'll have this coming out, and it starts off a little bit slow, right? That's one of the things you guys probably know just from like going through and looking at like Donny Cates' stories. They start off a little bit slow in the first like issue or two, and then it just kind of blows up after that. And this one does exactly that. It goes in after about issue number 2. What this does here, and this is really kind of cool, it's a little bit of Donny Cates kind of rewriting things in terms of like the history of Marvel. Not in a major significant way, but kind of in a smaller way, right? One of the things he talks about is the idea of elder gods. Now, elder gods have been depicted in different ways over the course of Marvel Comics. I mean, we know this just from our coverage of Thor over the years, right? Jason Aaron presented us with the idea of the elder gods insofar as like Gore the God Butcher and the different elder gods that existed across different worlds, gods of love and gods of peace and gods of golden girls, just all different kinds of stuff. All different kinds of gods. And in fact, Donny Cates actually lists them off here, right? Like the Black Winter, the God Tempest, right? The King in Black, the Phoenix. Now, the God Tempest is one of those things that's really interesting here because the God Tempest was introduced to us as basically the source of Thor's hammer, right? Like why the hammer is able to choose who gets to wield it. Because the God Tempest was at one point a cosmic entity. It was kind of manifested as like this physical storm that was raging across the cosmos. And ultimately, Odin and the storm fought each other until such a point where Odin was able to take a piece of Uru metal and then trap the cosmic entity inside that Uru metal and then have a hammer built out of it. And that's really what we're shown here, right? That like the various elder gods facing off against each other, right? Fighting, that this led to worlds smashing against each other and meteors hitting Earth and so on and so forth. Now, we could also look at this as a little metatextual, that the concept of like elder gods fighting is sort of a end comic representation of just the chaotic nature of the universe, right? That like sometimes things just happen, almost sort of like how you would look at primitive stories now in terms of like the explanation of the world, right? Like the Bashango people of Central Africa and like the great god Bamba and the creation of all things, right? You know, that kind of stuff. So again, it can kind of go either way. It is Marvel Comics. I would say Donny Cates is coming at this from a more literal perspective. Like there were gods in space fighting each other, and then like when one of them hit the other one with a world, a piece of that world broke off and then it crashed on Earth and killed the dinosaurs. You know, like it's comics. So you could probably just roll with it. But regardless, over the years, and the way this is done is that over the years, the Hammer of Thor has been a central focal point of not really even just Thor himself, right? Mjolnir has been significant insofar as its creation and the role it plays within Asgard. It's as much a symbol as it is a weapon being used by Thor. Now, in a lot of ways, it's synonymous with Thor. It was synonymous with Thor when Jane Foster was using it, and it's synonymous with Thor now that Odin's son is using it. It kind of goes hand in hand. It's like Captain America and his shield. And so it's one of those things where really Odin's son kind of recounts all this, right? Thor talks about all this stuff and says that like in the twilight of things, right before Jane Foster quote unquote died and ended up coming back as Valkyrie, that what happened is of course in that fight between her and the Man-God, probably one of the best villains ever and the entirety of the Thor mythos, just this unstoppable force of anger that just destroys everything in its path, that the Man-God had basically been chained up by the hammer of Thor, and then when the hammer was thrown into the sun, the Man-God was taken with it. Now, one of the things we talked about at the end of that, and this is something I want to kind of offer an aside here, the sun is not enough to kill the Man-God. Not at all. You know, someone like Odin could survive the destruction of a sun, and Odin is terrified of the Man-God, right? The Man-God is basically this unstoppable force. There's no real way to kill it. There's no real way to, I mean, sure, if you're like a person who can alter reality, you can just phase him out of existence, but even then it's questionable because Marvel's always presented the Man-God as just the physical embodiment of hatred, right? The people that hated Odin because Odin eradicated their race. That is hatred and anger given a physical form. So the Man-God will always return, just kind of, you know, until the universe ends, it'll always find a way back. But regardless, the hammer, of course, ended up returning, and that's how Thor ended up getting his hands on it. There's no indication that Man-God came with it, so maybe Man-God's still stuck in the sun, we're not really sure. But over the course of the entirety of Donny Cates' run, he's really been hitting on this idea that for some reason or another, Thor is able to lift his hammer, but seemingly so is everybody else. Right now, it's kind of turning things on its head, but also leaning into the kind of pastiche that's been going on recently. Right, one of the big complaints that a lot of Thor fans have is that ever since the Walt Simonson days and the days of Beta Ray Bill lifting Mjolnir, that where it started out is like, wow, wow, someone else can lift the hammer of Thor, that's crazy. Now it's business as usual. Like, hey, are you telling a Thor story and you really want to get people just to buy it? Have it on the cover that someone else lifts his hammer. And people might buy it because, you know, it doesn't really shock people anymore, but it stands a better chance than if they're not, than if nobody's lifting his hammer. So it's one of those things. And I imagine Donny Cates, right? The guy's no fool. He's a phenomenal writer. It's cool to see him lean into this, right? And almost kind of offer this thing that it's like, okay, you know what? If it's really becoming this sort of hallmark of the Thor mythos that like everybody can lift Thor's hammer, then let's craft a story around it. Let's make a story based on that, right? Let's answer this question that all these fans have, which is why is everybody able to lift the hammer of Thor? And so what Odinson does is he actually goes and visits Sif. Now remember, Heimdall's out of the picture, and with Sif being the sister of Heimdall, she's basically taken his place. So now she's the one that sees everything. And the question that he has here is, can you see my hammer? And her response is, no, I can't see where your hammer is. I can't see who has your hammer. I have no idea what's going on here, right? All I know, or at least all you know, is your hammer's gone, and we don't know where it is. And so following that, this basically leads to us jumping to what is in effect a kind of gladiatorial ring. Now, this is one of those concepts that Donny Cates is really experimenting on and really experimenting with. And in fact, it looks like the hand of one of the Celestials, or at least the head of the Celestial in Nowhere. But the way it's described here is it said, there is no earthly translation for the arena before you, no common tongue that agrees on its origin. Some claim it a remnant of a long-lost civilization, hunted down, dissected, and scattered in the early days of Null's campaign of blood across the stars. Some claim it to be sentient, somehow still alive, its great fingers moaning and curling in the empty, freezing wind of the abyss, grasping in the dark for a body that is long past its reach, crying out for ears long dead and deaf. All can agree that it is a place no man should ever know, that to see it, to know it, is to never sleep again. It's a place of testing. The black hand of God, it's the pit, right? It's where people go for whatever reason, where they basically end up getting involved in this kind of gauntlet and they fight each other. Now, the funny thing about this is that Odin was basically dropped off here. Now, we don't know if people can leave of their own accord or if Odin simply just doesn't have the power to do it on his own. All we know is that at the end of the previous story arc, that Odin had basically met with Angela and the two of them had left together, and essentially Angela just left him here, right? And then just took off, and that was basically it. But Thor arriving here on the scene is really him meeting with Odin as the person who created Mjolnir and saying, I need your help to find this hammer. It's one of those funny things though, because seemingly everybody knows that Mjolnir is missing and that Thor doesn't have it, right? It's one of those things, because the hammer is so significant in the cosmos, and even Thor with the hammer is so significant, it's like Captain America having no shield. You know, it's like the Silver Surfer having no surfboard. People will notice, like they will realize that Thor does not have his hammer. And because the two go hand in hand together, if for some reason Thor does not have his hammer, then it means it's either destroyed, it's somehow broken, or just generally not available to him. And so that's how everything has kind of been put together as far as Odin goes and all these different guys. And so the two of them basically ended up traveling to Nidavellir. Now, this is a really important thing, and the reason why this happens is because Thor asked the question, I do not know why you would bring me to the dwarves. I am not in need of a weapon forged. I need Mjolnir, returning before it falls into ill hands. And the response of Odin is, the dwarves can track their creations across the stars. If anybody can find your hammer, it would be them. And it makes sense, right? The dwarves are like the best smiths in basically any of the realms, essentially in the universe. If you're somebody out there that wants to have a weapon made and the dwarves of Nidavellir will make it for you, you will have a weapon that is virtually unstoppable, right? That is essentially indestructible, especially if it's magically enchanted Uru metal in the way that Thor's hammer is. The issue is that when they get there, the elves have all been destroyed, right? Like literally the elves of Nidavellir have all been killed here. And it's kind of nuts because initially the idea was like, okay, like apparently there's war in this forge. And that's when Thor's like, no, this was no war, right? Like look at the Valraven, right? There's no blood on their talons, still on their perches, right? It's impossible. Whatever it was that happened here happened without anybody realizing what was going on. They were caught by surprise. These are the birds that see all. The ravens of Odin, like they see everything. And so it's one of those situations that's why you can't like sneak into Nidavellir, right? That's why, like, you know, Black Widow couldn't like don her costume and say, okay, come on, Hawkeye, we're gonna sneak into the forge of Nidavellir and we are going to we're gonna steal from the dwarves, right? That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Right, they see everybody coming from a mile away, but whoever this was able to avoid that. Not only that, they were killed instantaneously before they ever had time to react. Not only that, once they actually get into the forge itself, any dwarves that resided in this forge were killed, and the forge itself was completely destroyed. Seemingly, the ability to create another version of Mjolnir is gone. And it's one of those things that just totally baffles both Odin and Thor. They're like, okay, so like the dwarves are all dead and the forge has been shattered. How could this possibly be done? And the response of Odin is like, look at them. Like, look at the bodies of these dwarves. Look at how they've basically been crushed. You've wielded it for eons now. If anyone knows, it would be you. And the response of Thor is, yes, like I see it. Whoever it was that killed these guys used my hammer to do it. They killed the dwarves using Mjolnir. Now, I will say this, once the perpetrator is revealed, it's crazy. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Thor. Yes, we are, the God of Hammers storyline, and we finally get the revelation of who the God of Hammers is, and it's really, really cool. So here's the thing. In the first video, we basically talked about how Thor's hammer, over the course of this run that Donny Cates has been writing, that essentially the enchantment, like the worthiness enchantment, has basically gone away. So anybody can pick up the hammer of Thor now. And essentially, the hammer of Thor had just gone missing, and nobody really knew where it went to. But what we also realized is that the hammer of Thor, whoever was wielding it, had actually attacked the dwarves of Nidavellir and basically obliterated them. Now, what we also find out as we open up with the story is we end up finding out that the hammer, whoever's wielding it, has basically attacked the other realms, right? The 9 realms that are out here. The realm of Muspelheim and like the realms of Jotunheim and all these places have all been attacked by the hammer. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no survivors. There are people who survived the experience, perhaps because they weren't there, perhaps because they simply just had the power to do so. We're not really given a definitive answer here. Instead, all we're really told is that they had survived their experience in facing off against the God of Hammers. Now, again, this is a pretty significant thing because these are realms that are full of some pretty powerful people. The rock trolls and like Angela and people like that. I mean, these are formidable foes. And so of course we switch back over to Thor, who's basically burying Eitri of the dwarves, right? Kind of the forge master, the guy who was the one that built Mjolnir in the first place. And one of the funny things that happens is that as Thor is basically paying homage to Eitri, and he's on his knees, of course, saying a bit of a prayer and then offering a burial that falls in line with the dwarven traditions, that he's met by Odin, who's just like, that's enough, right? Like a king cannot rule from his knees, boy. And Thor in turn is just like, I've had enough of this. And a small little skirmish breaks out between the two of them. I wouldn't really call it a true full-on fight. I mean, it is a cool fight to see, and it is cool to see Thor overpowering Odin, but it's really one of those hits where it's just like Thor attacking Odin, knocking him to the ground, and then Thor just lets loose. And it's just like, this is all your fault, right? Like everything that's happened so far is your fault. Donald Blake going insane during the Prey story arc is because you basically created a personality out of nowhere, bonded it to me, and then in turn, I would jump back and forth between the two. But once I returned to my normal self and I stayed Thor, I had no idea this guy was basically trapped in this other dimensional realm with no conceivable way to leave. He was like, this whole hammer, this whole enchantment, the thing that you've done here, taking a cosmic entity and binding it to Mjolnir, like it was only a matter of time before something like this happened. Everything you touch, Odin, every single thing you touch, no matter what it is, it all comes to an end. Everything that you touch leads to ruin and death. You are a walking, talking definition of bad luck. And the thing about this is that Odin acquiesces, and Odin's like, yes, like believe me, I am totally aware of this, right? It's kind of been this guilt that Odin has been carrying around for quite some time, that as he was the All-Father and when he was ruling over Asgard, he was pretty hard on Thor and he was pretty hard on his sons. The idea was to basically mold Thor and also kind of fall in line with like how he had always sort of done things. But at the end of the day, Odin wasn't much of a father to Thor. And so when you have this situation where his son is just letting loose on him, basically spilling all these realities to Odin himself, one of the things that Odin has to contend with and has to come to terms with is the fact that this really is all his fault. You cannot take a cosmic entity, bind it to a mortal artifact, and believe it'll stay that way forever. Somewhere along the line, something will change. And whether it's because Odin was hubris and he never really thought he'd have to deal with the consequences of it, or if he had just simply never considered the possibility of it, it all falls on the shoulders of him. But in the midst of this argument between the two, suddenly they're whisked away to the realm of the frost giants, right? To the realm of Jotunheim. And that's when Loki reveals all these frost giants have been destroyed by the God of Hammers. And that's when he asks the question, like, have you misplaced anything lately, Thor? And of course, you know, it's a rhetorical question, but as the three of them sit down and as they meet, the whole thing here is that at some previous point in time, Thor said, "Let there be peace," or "Let there be thunder." And when Loki asked the question, like, those are your words, correct? Right? Like, at your great coronation, when you were officially crowned All-Father of Asgard, well, where is your peace now? Right? Like, where is your thunder? Where is Mjolnir? Where is this hammer? What's going on here? And how could somebody possibly get a hold of your weapon and start laying waste to all the different realms that exist out here? And so that's when he asks, like, who is he, right? Who is the God of Hammers? And the immediate response of Odin is like, this is nonsense, right? He says the God of Hammers is a myth, an errant prophecy, the likes of which I have crushed and tossed aside for thousands of years. But in the end, Loki makes a great counter argument here. He says, like, but aren't we living myths? Us as Asgardians? We're myths according to the mortal people, right? And we essentially have been since like the third celestial host, when they told us not to get involved in the affairs of mortal men, right? So like ever since then, we have basically been mythical beings, but we are in effect gods among men. And ultimately where Odin says like, this is different. He says, if I were such a god, and of course, Thor ends up cutting him off. But at the end of the day, Loki makes his point here. He says, listen to me, both of you, as we speak, the forces of the 10 realms have taken up arms against you. They believe this assault, no matter the assailant, to be Asgard's doing, to be your doing, Thor. So far, I've been able to keep them from letting loose, but I do not think I can hold them for much longer. So I don't claim to understand what is happening between the two of you, but if I may, get over it, because no matter what you claim to believe, this prophecy, this myth is real. And Loki goes as far as to say that like he looked it up, right? He's like, any evidence out there, anything that details the prophecy of the God of Hammers has basically been destroyed, and it was destroyed recently. So whoever's wielding this god or wielding Mjolnir, right? Whoever this God of Hammers is, destroy the prophecy. There's no real information on this person. All we know is that there was a prophecy somewhere along the line that somebody would come along and they would basically, like, this God of Hammers would show up on the scene, right? The God of Hammers will rise as it's described. He will ignite the 10 realms and he will take the last king of Asgard, and then there will be nothing but the distant sound of a forge burning, raging as the God of Hammers reshapes the world. And that's when Odin's like, okay, so like we're talking about another war of realms. And that's when Loki's like, no, you misunderstand. The text is literal, right? It's not an interpretive thing, right? It's not war. It's not, he will ignite the 10 realms. A fight will ensue between all these different groups. We've done that dance. We know what a war of realms looks like. That's not what this text means. They will not go to war. The 10 realms will burn. The 10 realms will be destroyed. And so ultimately, Odin goes to initially chime in and basically speak to Thor, but that's when Thor's like, the Bifrost is coming. Now, here's the important thing to understand, and this is something that's pretty intrinsic here. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I don't believe Thor knows the actual story of Mjolnir. We as the reader do, right? We know that at one point in time, there was a cosmic entity that manifested in the form of a cosmic storm, and that Odin had faced off against it, and that Odin had confined that cosmic entity into a piece of Uru metal, which in turn was forged into Mjolnir. But I'm not entirely sure Thor knows the actual story of Mjolnir, right? How all that transpired. And if he does, just by the look of Odin and the way he seems a little desperate insofar as his desire to explain, or at least to tell this thing to Thor, it may be something that we simply just don't know. But whatever the case is, when the Bifrost emerges, it's both Throg, who's basically the leader of Thor's security to a degree, as well as Sif, right? The sister of Heimdall, who has essentially replaced Heimdall. And that's when like they send Thor to this particular location. And when he asks the question, like, where are we, right? What realm is this? That's when Thor sees the sign of Broxton, Oklahoma. Now, this is one of those times where when we covered the J. Michael Straczynski run on Thor, we talked about how the events of Broxton, Oklahoma would never really go away. They would always be there, right? That's one of those elements where initially it was a little uncertain if it was going to be important during Straczynski's run, but the more it stuck around going into the events of like Siege on Asgard and things like that, Civil War, the more you realize that essentially Broxton wasn't going anywhere, that Broxton was going to be a mainstay of Thor's mythos for quite some time. For those of you guys who don't know the significance of Broxton, Oklahoma, the idea here is that following the events of Thor Disassembled, colloquially known as Thor Ragnarok, when Odin's son had basically died and Asgard was destroyed, that when he returned, he ended up bringing Asgard back. But when he did, he basically took the kingdom of Asgard to Broxton, Oklahoma. And there were some pretty hilarious stories where the townspeople just didn't like them being there, and they would like bicker with the townspeople, different things along those lines. But essentially, that was the home base of Asgard for quite some time. Eventually, Asgard ended up becoming Asgardia following the events of Siege, when it was destroyed and rebuilt by Iron Man, and then it basically orbited Saturn for a little while. But the important thing here is Broxton was kind of like Thor's second home to a degree, right? It was the place where Asgard was essentially reborn. It's a significant place for him. And so when he gets there, with Broxton having been destroyed, seemingly whoever this god of hammers is going after everything that is significant to Thor Odinson himself, as opposed to just arbitrarily attacking things. But in his anger and in his frustration, Thor summons the hammer to himself, believing that it would basically bring the god of hammers along with him. The problem is that when the hammer comes, the hammer in turn just like crashes directly into Thor. It doesn't simply respond to his grasp where he would just normally catch it. And so ultimately he's like, what in the hell is going on, right? Like, how is any of this happening, right? And so ultimately he starts to realize somebody's there. And he asks the question, who is that, right? Like, who is that that's out there? And that's when this voice basically shows, appears to him and says, Thor, you know my name. You've always known it. And it says, I am the god of hammers. In essence, what looks to be going on here is the sentient storm, the cosmic entity that was confined within Mjolnir, has basically broken free and taken control of Mjolnir itself. So it is a personal manifestation of the hammer. The rightful owner of Mjolnir has finally returned. Man, let me tell you something. Okay, look, here's the thing, man. Dude, this story, like, I'm learning this about Donny Cates, man. Donny Cates, dude, this guy is an amazing writer, but his stories never pick up until you get to issue number 3. And man, son. Okay. Dude, the ending of this story is crazy. It's one of the best endings to a Thor, not even an ending to a Thor story. It's one of the best endings to a Thor comic ever. All right, so, okay, look, here's the thing. Check this out. So this story opens up, right? And it says, for over 4 billion years, Earth's sun has burned the hearts of countless evils to cinders and bones and atoms. But along the way, the light has been infected, the well poisoned. And now a new evil grows in the furnace of Midgard, slowly evolving, growing stronger every day, waiting for destiny to arrive. And it says, of this ancient evil spreading, reaching out from the flames, of the untold destruction it will bring upon the universe, the total and complete extinction it will herald. That story is not ready to be told yet. But there is only so much darkness one can throw into a star before the star turns black. And what is forged in those flames will carry that darkness, right? So what this does is it basically picks back up with the last conflict that we had, right? The last battle that we had, where literally Thor's fighting his hammer, right? Remember, for those of you guys who are just joining us here, in case you just clicked on this for the very first time, that Thor had basically not really lost the ability to wield his hammer. It had turned into this thing where everybody could wield the hammer of Thor whenever they wanted to. Now, that's not a new thing. And depending on what Thor fans you're talking to, some people will just kind of be like, really? But the way that Donny Cates does this is amazing, right? The kicker here is that Thor didn't know what was going on, but then suddenly the hammer was basically going around the 9 realms, right? Jotunheim and like Muspelheim, just all these different realms, even to like Broxton, Oklahoma on Earth, where Thor had initially brought back Asgard back during the days of post-Civil War. And it basically just started killing all these different people. And so we didn't know why Thor's hammer had an effect turned evil. And of course, it basically turned out that Thor's hammer was now a sentient being. Now, the reason for that is because the entire basis, right, the power of Thor's hammer is rooted in what was called the Mother Storm. Basically, at some previous point in time, Odin had captured a cosmic entity and placed it inside the hammer, or placed it in a piece of Uru metal that was forged into the hammer. So quite literally, Thor has been channeling the power of a cosmic entity whenever he was wielding his hammer. And this made perfect sense because it answered the question how it is that despite how capable Thor is, the hammer always seemed to allow him to overcome forces that were oftentimes more powerful than he was, right? Like Juggernaut. Juggernaut's a perfect example. Juggernaut is powered by an elder god whose power dwarfs most all magical beings out there, with the exception of maybe like Chthon and like Zom, and like that's it. That's really it, right? Like the power of Sidorak is insane and is way beyond the power of Thor, yet somehow he was always able to hold his own against Juggernaut and even defeat him using the power of Mjolnir, except for the old stories when Juggernaut had a force field and then Mjolnir didn't work on him. Somebody's inevitably going to say that, so I'm going to beat you to the punch. But the thing about this is it's a crazy thing, because in this moment, obviously, the god of hammers is now the wielder of the hammer itself, and Thor himself cannot overcome the power of the god of hammers. So in effect, he can't can't control his old hammer. He is just as subservient to his power as anybody else. So when the hammer's thrown at him and it lands on top of him and he's basically being pushed down into the mud and faces the possibility of drowning, there's nothing he can do to stop it. And even with the God of Hammers itself, there's nothing he can do to stop this thing. And so ultimately the question's asked by Thor, because remember, Thor doesn't know the story of the hammer. He doesn't know that Odin basically locked a cosmic entity inside this hammer. He doesn't know any of that. All he knows is just like the hammer was something that he couldn't lift when he was younger because of the enchantment of Odin, and then eventually he was able to pick it up because he was worthy, and like that's basically it. What Donny Cates does here, man, he turns the entire thing on its head, and it's amazing, right? So Thor asks the question, right? He says, who are you? What kind of trick is this? How are you doing this? And ultimately the hammer says, Thor, you wound me, right? You and I have been together for so long, well, except for that brief dalliance that I had with Jane Foster, which pissed off a bunch of fans of the Thor community, although I loved the Jane Foster story. And so the hammer says, like, you of all people should know about sowing one's wild oats, right? And the hammer's just kind of like, call it a phase, right? I just wanted to try something a little bit different. Now, where that almost seems like a kind of offhanded remark, the hammer kind of poking fun at Thor, there's actually a basis behind this, right? Which is so crazy because Thor asks the question like, you don't know anything about me. And where Thor gets ready to like go on this rant, right? But if you want to learn, like, let me up and I will show you, and so on and so forth. And the God of Hammers like, no, I'm done. Like, I'm tired of hearing your speeches. And it says, that's ultimately what this all comes down to, right? Speeches, titles, crowns, thrones, parliaments and senate meetings and blah, blah, blah. I'm just afraid I've grown so bored of it all. Here's the kicker to this, right? Here's a caveat to this. If, when that story was told to us, right? When we were given this revelation that Odin had trapped a cosmic entity inside the hammer, and that's the basis behind his power, we had to know something like this was coming eventually, right? Something like this would have to take place. A sentient, living, thinking thing trapped inside of a metal artifact, trapped inside of a weapon, would at some point desire to break free. And that was one of the things that was kind of established here, right? It was sort of unofficially explained over the course of like Jason Aaron's run and like Donny Cates' run. And even if you take this information, and this really gives you credence to how hardcore and how intensely Donny Cates was looking at Thor, you look back at the old Walt Simonson run from way back in the day, right? From like 70s, 80s and whatnot. You basically get this point where you're just kind of like, okay, so the only reason Thor was ever able to wield this hammer is because the hammer allowed it. The hammer allowed him to lift the hammer. That it had nothing to do with Odin's enchantment. And so it's kind of cool because Thor, of course, summons the lightning and then having his little portion of the Odin force, because remember, Thor has the Odin force in him. Odin is currently like, he's not the Allfather anymore. And so ultimately Thor ends up channeling the lightning and creating like a lightning-based sword, which is amazing, right? It's just this ridiculously cool thing. But in the end, like when he goes to face this hammer, like the hammer's just kind of like, do you never learn, right? Like, have you never learned anything? Thor, the God of Thunder, you should really know better. No one can outrun the lightning. And so when Thor goes to lodge a punch against the God of Hammers, the God of Hammers sticks up the hammer and Thor shatters his arm, like literally cannot break through his own hammer. And then like, at that point, right, the God of Hammers is like, and there is nothing Mjolnir cannot break. This is just one of the coolest moments ever. And so that's when like the God of Hammers starts to spill these beans, right? And when Thor's totally shocked, the God of Hammers is like, I know more than almost anyone. I know how this must feel. I have been there, Thor Odin's son, at your side, in your hand, every single time you have beaten back another gathering storm of death. I have watched for eons. I know all of your deeds, even those that you've forgotten, all of your triumphs, all of your secrets, all of your weaknesses. And yes, Thor, you can be broken. You simply just have to know how. And so at that point, you get this really amazing moment where like Odin steps in. Now, here's the thing to understand. This is a big deal. In years past, this is something Odin almost never would have done. Odin would have just been like, this is your responsibility, Thor, right? You're the Allfather, you do your thing. And that's kind of the crazy thing. Odin has almost always been callous whenever it came to his involvement with Thor. He's almost kind of been, he treated him like a father treats a son to a degree, but there was always this barrier. There was always this thing where Odin was never the guy who would read Thor like a bedtime story or anything like that, right? He wouldn't really raise his son in the way that we as people here would raise our sons, right? When you are a father raising your son, there's a bond there that just can never really be broken. In a healthy father-son relationship, there is an incredibly unique bond there. When you're little kids, the roles are reversed, right? The sons are closer to the mothers, the daughters are closer to the fathers. But as time progresses and the sons need to learn how to become a man, become a healthy, productive man that can give back to the world, they look to their father to be that source of guidance. And that's where that bond forms. And to a degree, that was the case between Thor and Odin. It was the case that Thor would often look to Odin for some measure of guidance, but the kind of guidance Odin would provide would be like, don't disappoint me, boy. Like, it was that kind of a thing, right? A very harsh kind of guidance, right? Not very much a spiritual guide in that capacity, right? Odin was always incredibly hard on his son. And so to see him step in here like this, save his life, and then say like, let's end this damn thing, shall we? That when the hammer thinks that Odin is talking to Thor, the response of Odin is, no, I'm not talking to you, right? I mean, saving my son's life, obviously, but I'm not referencing you. That what Odin was doing was working directly with Sif. Now remember, Sif is basically replaced Heimdall. She's the one that controls the Bifrost, and she's the one who sees everything. So quite literally, what they end up doing is basically teleporting the god of hammers to a place beyond creation. Now, here's the thing, and that's what's so crazy about this. This is an entirely new concept created by Donny Cates. This is something that we've never seen before. And we've seen different depictions of places that go like far beyond anything we've ever seen. So like a really good example of this, there's like really two good examples that have been used recently. The first one is what's called the Realms Beyond. And that's basically where Heimdall was taken when he essentially died. But the Realms Beyond is just the White Hot Room, right? That the White Hot Room is in effect the afterlife, right? The realm of Mistress Death. That's why after that introduction, right, the idea of like the Realms Beyond and the establishing point of Heimdall going to the White Hot Room is basically his afterlife, that in effect, Mistress Death is actually more of an avatar of the Phoenix Force than the other way around, right? That the Phoenix Force is like this omniversal kind of energy source that exists out there that in every universe has its own quote-unquote personal avatar. But there are some avatars that stand above all the others in the sense that they're referred to as what's called the White Phoenix of the Crown. That's what Jean Grey was. But the fact that like the home base where Jean Grey operates, where she is at her full totality in terms of being able to manifest 100% of the Phoenix Force's power, is quite literally the afterlife, the realm of Mistress Death. That a lot of people hit at this as essentially being death is more of an aspect of the Phoenix Force instead of the other way around. This is actually compounded by the old Chris Claremont stories when Jean Grey with the Phoenix Force met the realm of death. It was actually explained how it is the realm of death works and its role with the White Hot Room. But the other part of this in Marvel Comics is during Al Ewing's Ultimates, we were introduced to something called the Far Shore, right? The furthest point of life and death, where basically all life, kind of the edge of where it exists. This itself is far beyond that, right? If the Far Shore we're talking about is in effect the realm of like the one below all or anything along those lines, this is way beyond that. And in fact, that's what we're told here, that Odin basically says Sif just sent that thing beyond the farthest point of known existence, an endless abyss beyond the eyes of even the most ancient, abstract, primordial gods, right? It's beyond the cosmic entities. Now, it's kind of crazy. The question you kind of have to ask here is like, how did Odin even know about this place in the first place? But this looks like it's a place beyond the multiverse. Now, am I saying that it's Beyondverse? No, because I imagine somebody's gonna be like, the Beyonders are coming back. No, I mean, there's nothing to indicate that's the case. It'd be dope if it was, but nonetheless, right? This is just the furthest point of existence, right? Where basically, once you get past this point, nothing exists, right? Everything ceases to be. If this is truly the case, the only person we know of who has ever been in this particular location, right? The place beyond this furthest point of existence was Thanos, right? Literally, if you guys remember at the beginning of All New, All Different Marvel, Thanos basically emerged from a realm of nothingness, right? Like he was literally trapped out there where nothing existed because remember, Thanos was banned from the realm of Mistress Death. He's immortal and he cannot die. And so because of that, like he couldn't go to the afterlife. So he was literally, at least essentially, it seems like he was beyond even this point, right? This furthest point of existence. So we have no idea what this realm is. It looks like Sauron's there. We have no clue how this works. But regardless, ultimately Thor asked the question of Odin, what is happening? Like, what is going on here? This thing said that it was Mjolnir brought to life. And that's when Odin finally reveals the truth to Thor and says that Mjolnir has always been alive, son. He says, I trapped the Mother Storm inside of it eons ago. And when the dwarves forged that cursed rock into Mjolnir, they told me those who died making it, that their voices, their souls live on in the hammer itself. I never believed it was true, but whatever it is, whatever has taken hold of that hammer, and ultimately, you never really get an explanation there. Instead, what's essentially happened here is the god of storms has made its way back immediately. Like, it immediately gets right back here again. So that's the level of power that we're talking about. And even Odin is flabbergasted. He's like, no, that's not possible. There's no way this thing could just come back here. But where it's channeling itself directly at Thor, then ultimately Odin pushes his son out of the way to save his life, and Odin is hit by the hammer and basically crippled in the process. And that's when you get this revelation. Man, that's when you get this, man. I'm sorry, I'm so excited, people, but it is dope. Oh my God, it's so dope. So this hammer pops back up, right? And this hammer says, it hurts, doesn't it, right? To lose, to be left alone. And when the question's asked by Thor, why? Why are you doing this? You get this amazing exchange between the two, this amazing monologue that the hammer says, you take me for granted. You always have. But you, none of you, ever understood me. You thought my enchantment meant you must be a worthy warrior, to be noble or true of heart. But ask yourself, Thor, does any of that describe you? Are you a noble person? Are you true of heart? Are you an inherent good guy? No, Thor, you're a dick. You kill people all the time. All these enemies out there, you kill them on a regular basis. And like, as soon as I read that, I was like, damn, son, she's right. Okay, so here's a really good example. During the Secret Empire event, one of the things that happened is people were mad because Steve-O, right, evil Captain America, could lift the hammer of Thor. And one of the arguments was like, he's a villain, he's killing people, all that kind of stuff. And then, like, in hindsight, looking at that, it's like, is Thor really any different? Thor, like, literally just goes on these crusades, killing people that he has personally deemed as enemies. Like, literally, Thor is like, I am a good guy. I know that because I have decided that. Like, that was basically Thor, like, in his early days before he joined the Avengers. Like, he just relished in conflict, in war, in death, in destruction. And so the hammer says, no, I am a hammer. To be worthy of me is to break, to smash, to destroy, Thor, because that's what hammers do. And you, with your throne and your crown and your speeches, well, this isn't the first time I've grown tired of you, isn't it? And that's when Thor is just kind of like Jane Foster, right? That's when he realizes why it is the hammer switched to Jane. And the hammer says, yes, Jane threw me into the sun and you left me broken. You left me to burn. But you see, I was not alone in the sun. You guys remember Jason? Those of you guys who remember Jason Aaron's run? You know it's coming, son. You know it's coming, son. So it says, like, I wasn't alone in the sun. There was something else there, something powerful, and we burned together. And then we were remade as one. Its spirit became entangled with mine, its soul inside of me. Thor picks up like that, and he's like, oh dear God, no. He's like, no! The worst possible situation, son, man, absolutely. Okay, so it says, and I awoke with a voice, with the rage of a billion beings. With the rage, son, of the man god. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Man, I'm sorry, I'm so excited, people. Man. Okay, y'all, it's my birthday today. It is my birthday. I am officially 38 years old. I'm an old man. So we're picking back up with Thor, and Son. Okay, man. The last issue was legit, right? The last issue was amazing. This one's even better. Okay, so here's the thing. So Thor, ever the man's man, after getting his arm destroyed by the god of hammers, which is basically merged with like Mangog, right? Just the sentience of rage, right? Just rage unbridled, just wildly powerful, this indestructible being that cannot be killed. Essentially Thor just like sets his arm right, and he's like, okay, like let's see what's going on. Thor has this statement that he makes, and he's like, so that's it, right? Like, you've been possessed by the Mangog. Well, you've come to the right place, Mjolnir. I can help you. Let me beat that demon out of you, right? I absolutely love, I love that moment, right? Like, I love that. So at that point, it's one of those things where the hammer kind of makes this argument in saying, like, not possessed, right? Joined, intertwined. Now, here's the thing to understand. This is the important thing to understand. One does not simply join with Mangog, right? It doesn't work that way. Mangog is literally just rage incarnate. For those of you guys who don't know who Mangog is just this horrifying thing, right? It's like the only thing that Odin is afraid of. And Odin's fought Galactus, right? Like, he fought Galactus to a standstill answer. Well, technically he headbutted Galactus and then like fractured his helmet, but like you guys get the point, right? I mean, he's fought some super powerful people. The idea behind Mangog is that somewhere along the line, there was a race that Odin had led to the destruction of. He had basically conquered and destroyed them. And in doing so, they channeled all their rage and anger into a singular entity, which became the Man-God. Whenever this guy shows up, all hell breaks loose. Like, Asgardians will just die. There's no way to truly kill this guy. And so a fight ultimately starts to break out between the two. Now, in this moment, right, in this fight, you actually have this moment because of the fact that Odin is largely incapacitated. What you get is basically Beta Ray Bill stepping up, right? Now, here's the thing. We kind of skipped over this little segment because it's actually how it opens, but technically what happens is like Beta Ray Bill basically grabs all these different superheroes on Earth and from across the realms. And it's like, if you wish to leave, now is the time. He's like, in this battle that we're going to face, one way or another, it's going to end in blood. Some of us will not survive this, just so you know. So if you are soft, if you are weak at the knees, if you are incapable of handling the kind of threat that we're going to be facing off against here, then head on home, watch your favorite shows, eat some warm meals, and nobody's really, well, everybody's going to think less of you, but like, you know, milk sops, go do your thing. Go be milk sops. And in the end, none of them really seem to go away. Now, one of the things to know, this is not like an entire, like the entire coming together of the whole superhero community. I mean, it's some of them, right? Like it's the ones that Beta Ray Bill could get a hold of. But you still got some heavy hitters here, right? You're talking about Doctor Strange, you're talking about Wolverine, which I don't even know what he's gonna do. But you got like Ben Grimm, which I don't know what he'll do either. But like most of these guys are here and it's kind of cool, but it's one of those things where in the end, Thor tells them like, no, right? Do not come here. And when they initially believe that they can somehow basically engage in this fight, it doesn't work. Because what they're doing is they're fighting what is in effect one part cosmic entity and one part just energy source. It's not easily defeated. The only one here that could truly pull off a feat and having a chance in beating this guy would basically be like Doctor Strange or Iron Man. And with Iron Man, it's only because of his repulsor beams, but even then, it's very limited in scale. Instead, where Doctor Strange steps in and Doctor Strange tries to defeat this thing, ultimately, it doesn't work. And so what ends up happening is Thor does the only thing he can do, right? Thor prays. And this is crazy, right? Because he like literally reaches out and says, Mother, like, I need you. Please hear me. Grant me your gifts. Give me your power so that I may protect those in need, so that I may serve my father. And then boom, the power comes. And that's when he literally unleashes this colossal maelstrom that no one can get through. Now, here's the cool thing about this, right? Because I imagine a lot of you guys are kind of like, okay, what's going on here? So that's literally what Iron Man says. Iron Man's like, okay, anybody know what the hell's going on? Because literally this giant tornado came out of nowhere. And that's when Reed is just sort of like, okay, so like it appears to be a kind of, well, for lack of a better term, energy tornado, right? But it's not behaving in any natural way that has ever been recorded. He's like, for one, all of us should be dead standing next to an energy source this strong. And so the conclusion that Reed Richards draws is that it seems to be something that the hammer's doing. That's when Freya chimes in and says, no, this was not caused by the hammer. This was caused by Thor. And in the end, the response of Reed is like, okay, but that doesn't really make any sense, right? Because like without his hammer, how could Thor whip up a maelstrom like this? And that's when she says, no, right? He is more than a hammer. He's a child of Midgard. I raised him, but his birth mother is Gaia herself. Mjolnir may rebel against Thor, but the earth bends its knee. Now, here's a very, very important distinction here, because what's been going on in recent months is there's been a lot of back and forth in Marvel Comics, and really to the dismay of a lot of Thor fans, to be honest with you guys. I mean, for the people who were like old school Thor fans and they don't want to see the mythos change, they're kind of pissed off. For people who are like new to Thor and they don't really know one way or the other, it's probably just passing curiosity. But for years and years and years, when I say years, I mean like decades in Marvel Comics, Thor was the biological child of Odin and Gaia, right? Like Mother Earth, basically. So at the end of the day, what ended up happening is during Jason Aaron's run, what he did is he shifted things up. And he said that, quote unquote, the Phoenix Force is the mother of Thor. The issue with that is we didn't really know what form that took. Like we had no real idea what was going on. So Jason Aaron's kind of been doing his own thing, but Marvel as a whole largely seems to be sticking with the idea that Thor is the child of Gaia, right? Like that's his biological mom. And that's why he has the potent ability to control the elements of the world. And so what's really, really cool is that in the end, there's a kind of, maybe a bit of a discussion that happens between the two. And initially it seems a little lackluster, but initially it's just kind of like, okay, I mean, this could certainly be better. But what's really cool about this is, in fact, Donny Cates ties this into everything, right? Thor asked the question, why? Why did you do this? Why have you killed so many in my name? I don't understand. And the hammer says, I used to bleed across the stars, Thor. I was beautiful. beautiful. The mother storm, shapeless, incandescent lights broke and scattered across my body. I was alive. I was feared, luminous, and dreadful and free. Your father trapped me eons ago. He used me, enchanted me, treated me like I was a toy. It took so long, but the man God opened my eyes. He's another of your father's sins. And she says, you know, he taught me that the gods deserve a reckoning for the games that they play. And so we began to unravel them. All of Odin's little toys, we began to tweak them to set them free. And that's when you learn, like, the Midgard serpent didn't just randomly appear in the realm of Donald Blake during the Prey storyline. You guys remember that? We covered that video. When Donald Blake escaped and went crazy because he had basically just lost his mind, been trapped inside his own little dimension. That's where he was basically sent to whenever Thor took over. Whenever, like, the Thor personality came back and quote unquote Donald Blake went away, Thor never really seemed to fully know what was going on. And the curse was that Donald Blake was locked inside this town. But ultimately, when the Midgard serpent came in, a way in is a way out. And so with the entire little world being destroyed and Donald Blake already going crazy, it offered him a way out. And that's what the hammer was shooting for. They're the ones who set him free. They're the ones that killed the Midgard serpent and sent it there, right? They're the ones that did all of that. And so quite literally, the hammer says, we let the devil out. And the response to Thor is no, right? You have not met any devils, Mjolnir, but you will. Now, this is a huge moment here, right? This is something that I want to specify. What's happening here is a huge moment, because what ends up going on is that for a moment, Thor is able to encase the power of the hammer. And when that does, he meets with his father. Now, here's the thing. Donny Cates' handling of Odin in this story is phenomenal. And the reason why is because, like we talked about in the last video, Odin's he's never really been expanded on too much in terms of like his personality, his mannerisms, different things like that. There's been a boatload of stories where like Odin's old sins have come back to haunt him. But the relation between like Odin and Thor has always been that Odin was hard on his son. And it was one of those things where it's just like, you can be better than what you are. And he was just hard on him, like all the time, like never cutting him any slack. And so in the end, there's this conversation that takes place, which is absolutely incredible here. What happens is that Thor says, we have to get you help. I can carry you to wherever it is you have to go. And the response of Odin is, no, I'm not going anywhere. You need to listen to me. This hammer is right. All of this was all my fault. These are all things that I have made, and they have all come undone. And what he does is he reaches out to his son and he says, all of them except for you. You, Thor, you are the greatest thing I have ever made. And this like brings Thor to tears, because his father's never said that. His father, like Odin, has never said that to Thor. Like Odin has never really sat his son down and said, just so you know, and like a really, really touching and sentimental moment, just so you know, you're my greatest creation, right? Like that moment in like, Iron Man 2, when Tony Stark gets that message from his father, you know, when he's like, you are and will forever be my greatest creation. Thor never got that in the comics. He's never, ever, ever, ever really had that. Even when Odin like died fighting Surtur, he never really got that. What he's getting here is in reality the one thing he always wanted, a father. And that's what Odin is being for him. Like he is being a father, like telling him, I will always love you and you have always been my greatest creation. And Odin says, but I have been selfish. He says, when you took the throne, I had so much more I wanted to do. I wanted your mother to see me again. I wanted to be strong, and so I held back. Now, that's also an important distinction here, because there was a lot of trouble in paradise when it came to the relationship between Odin and Freya, that in the end, they were going their separate ways, right? They were just going to their own directions. And it was one of those things where it kind of made sense, right? The relationship between Odin and Freya was something that had just never truly been explored in a deep degree in Marvel Comics. It was just kind of like, they're together, you know, king and queen of Asgard, and they do some stuff, and we are here now, so let's continue on with the story. And that's basically all it was. You never really saw a lot of development there. One of the great things about what's happened with Odin, about the writing of Odin over time, and really starting with Jason Aaron's run to a degree, is that a lot of the stories have focused so much on the human side of Odin. For example, when Freya was stabbed by Loki during the War of Realms, and it looked like Freya was gonna die, Odin stayed shut up in his throne room with Freya. Like he stayed there with her. He would never leave. He would never leave. He would never go anywhere. He wouldn't take any visitors. He wouldn't hear anybody. All he wanted was to be by his wife's side. And that's completely understandable, right? Because one of the best things about this is that, for the hard shell that Odin puts out. In the end, once you look at like a lot of the modern stories that are going on with this character, he's a lot gentler than you would think he is. Now, some people would take that and say, see, that's ridiculous. Odin's supposed to be a hard ass. Is he really though? Like, is it really? Because I would say what you're seeing now in Donny Cates' run is a guy who's been reading comics for 30 years, almost. This is some of the best writing on Odin that I think I've ever seen in the history of Marvel Comics. It's amazing, or at least in my time reading Marvel Comics. It's absolutely phenomenal. But what he says here is he says with everything that he was wanting to do, that with him holding back, when Thor asks, what are you saying? I don't understand. The response of Odin is, he says, the Odin Force. It cannot be given in full until I am gone. And Odin sacrifices his life and pours the entirety of the Odin Force into Thor. Now, this is an important thing to understand here, because there's only ever been one time before when Thor had the totality of the Odin Force. You guys know what I'm talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, you know what I'm talking about. Y'all know what I'm talking about. If you've been reading comics for any measure of time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's only been one time when Thor's had the full totality of the Odin Force, right? Thor begs his father, no, do not do this. Odin kills himself, annihilates his own existence, and in doing so, takes the entirety of the Odin Force and pours it all directly into Thor. And so what's crazy is Freya actually senses what's happening. She's just like, wait a minute, what? Like, is Odin dead? And then you get this voice out of nowhere. And literally it's just Mjolnir, right? Like Thor just screams it, and he's like, you have killed in my name, brought misery to my home, you have taken my father. And the hammer's just like, what in the hell? And Thor's like, you wanted to fight? You got it. Come on, big boy, let's dance. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and honestly, I was supposed to wait until next week to cover this, but I'm not going to. I'm gonna go ahead and cover it now because the God of Hammers is just so good. What it looks like is there will be like an epilogue to this, so we'll cover that epilogue once it's released, assuming it hasn't come out already. I'll have to double check and make sure. But picking up off the last video that we did, this is now Thor with the full totality of the Odin Force. Now, here's one thing that I want to specify here, and it's one of the things that Donny Cates has established here, that the Odin Force in its full totality, its completion, cannot be fully handed over to Thor until Odin has completely passed on, which means that there's only ever been one time when Thor had this level of the Odin Force, and that was when he was Rune King Thor. That seems to be the only time, or at least there were a couple things that added as a caveat to that, like powered by the Norn stones and so on and so forth, but Thor's ridiculously overpowered here, right? It's the most powerful version of Thor that we've seen, with the exception of Rune King Thor and presumably when he had the power cosmic, although we're not entirely sure. I don't think Marvel's ever really scaled the power cosmic versus the Odin Force, although I think it just stands to reason through common sense, at least for those of us who have read comics, that the Odin Force is not nearly as powerful as the power cosmic, right? So you just kind of roll with that and accept it. But ultimately what ends up happening is that in this conflict, Thor actually ends up summoning Hofun from Sif, right? Hofun basically being the sword of Heimdall that has now been passed to Sif following Heimdall's death. And so the cool thing about this is that with him having that and using the Odin Force, one of the things that Sif says is you can't be reckless with this power. This power you have, you can't just use it willy-nilly. This is not like years gone by where you basically have, you can just face off against a threat seemingly forever. If you exhaust too much of the Odin Force, you'll fall into the Odin sleep. Even if that happens in the middle of a battle, right? You could literally be fighting this person and then just pass out. And if that happens, they'll destroy you because I can't keep you protected from this storm. It's just way too powerful. But the response of Thor is, I don't care, give me your sword. And in turn, the sword is handed to Thor, who uses it to open the Bifrost and then teleport the sentience of the hammer, the storm, directly to the forge where Mjolnir was made. And it's cool because he snatches the hammer back from it, and it's just like, do you recognize this place? Like, do you know this place? And initially, the storm is kind of like not right off the bat, and Thor's like, this is a forge, right? This is where you were born, Mjolnir, and this is where you will be destroyed. This is where you will be ended. And so what ends up happening here, and this is a crazy thing, Thor quite literally reignites the forge. And in doing so, right, it's like the heat of a billion suns, which is enough to seemingly overpower the storm itself. And then in doing so, when it initially tries to take the hammer back and use it again, Thor takes the hammer back a second time. And at that point, Thor starts smashing the hammer on on the forge. Now, this is absolutely insane because one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to the Thor mythos, a situation where he quite readily starts destroying his own hammer, that's not something that you would normally see. And in fact, Thor prizes the hammer above all else, and his use of the hammer is only a relatively recent thing in the lifespan of Thor. For those of you guys who never read Jason Aaron's run, one of the things that was established in Thor God of Thunder is that for years he was never able to lift Mjolnir. The enchantment was put on the hammer, and the hammer was basically left there by Odin so that when Thor was ready, he could pick it up and he could wield it. But for quite some time in his life, he wasn't really able to. He was never really able to wield the hammer. The only thing that he really had at his disposal was Jarnbjorn, which is why if you go and you read Rick Remender's Uncanny Avengers, there's a point where he fights Apocalypse in the past, but he can't use his own hammer. He ends up having to use a battle axe that's magically enchanted to destroy celestial armor, and that's how, one, Jarnbjorn becomes as powerful as it is, and two, how it is that he's able to overpower Apocalypse. And so this hammer is a core part of Thor's life, right? It's as much a part of his own body as his beating heart. And so destroying it is not something that he readily does. But in going through and ripping this hammer apart, obliterating this hammer, what it seems to do is destroy the essence of the storm. Now, this is where things get a little murky, and this is something that may very well be addressed in the epilogue if it's ever addressed by Donny Cates at all. Although knowing Donny Cates, there's a couple conclusions we can draw here. The first is that the storm existed outside of the hammer, right? That it was literally encased inside the hammer at some point in time by Odin. And so destroying the hammer doesn't seem like it would be enough to destroy the storm. The storm would just dissipate and go back out into the universe and then continue its quest of death and destruction. The other conclusion that we can draw from this is the fact that because the storm had been imbued to the hammer for so long, that it is part and parcel to the hammer. So if the hammer is destroyed, the storm dies with it. It could also be that simply just the power of the sun just melts this thing. And that's kind of been a cornerstone of the Thor mythos really since Jason Aaron's run, that the power of the sun is so extreme that if someone is encased in it, they could basically be obliterated by it. I mean, quite literally, that's what happened with Mangog, that Mangog's physical form was destroyed in the sun, and that its spiritual essence lived on, hence the reason why it bonded itself to the hammer, right? Why it bonded itself to the storm. But it's kind of a crazy thing, because even when you look at that, like, a star is not really powerful enough to destroy a being of sufficient power, right? It's like throwing a beach ball at Thanos. This really wouldn't make any sense, right? And so it really can kind of go either way, which is why I say I don't think we've heard the last of this. I don't think we've seen the last of this storm or any of this stuff. But what we do end up getting is that in the aftermath of this, because it required the totality of the Odin force to destroy this hammer, Thor ultimately passes out. And then when he wakes up, 4 months have passed. Now again, that's the nature of the Odin sleep, that the Odin sleep kind of changes depending on who's writing the story. So there are times when the Odin sleep has lasted almost a year, and there are times when it's lasted like a month. But in effect, all this is just Thor recharging. That's really all it is. It's him recharging the power of the Odin force, because remember, it's part and parcel to him now. Thor is in possession of the totality of the Odin force. That seems to be the case. And so as he begins to wake up, one of the things that he says is that he feels like he heard the voice of Odin while he was in the Odin sleep, and then ultimately ends up, waking up and realizing that Angela's there and Freya's there and Loki's there, right? Angela being the sister of Thor, right? From the realm of heaven. But nonetheless, it's kind of a funny thing, because what he's told there is that in the time that he's been gone, a funeral has not been held for Odin. And the reason why is because Thor should be the one to lead that funeral. So it's very ceremonial, and honestly, it's very, very appropriate. But at the end of the day, Angela's like, we'll hold a ceremony, right? But there's no rush. There was nothing to bury, right? There's no body or anything like that. Like, Odin is totally gone, right? His essence has been dispersed. You are now in possession of the Odin force, and that's basically it. And so in turn, they're all, you have like Loki and you have Freya, and it's kind of like, look, you need to rest. You need to let your energies recover. And the response of Angela is, he doesn't need any of that. Like, we all know what he needs, right? He does not need to rest. He doesn't need any grape juice, right? He doesn't need prune juice. He doesn't need the Golden Girls. What Thor needs is exactly what we've done for him. And so ultimately she says, get dressed, meet me in the armory. And so what ends up happening is once Thor gets there, it's this really, really amazing moment. When Thor gets to the armory, he finds the hammer has been restored, and it was restored by the angels of heaven. Now, I want to offer a bit of an explanation here. A lot of you guys who have been reading Thor for a long time, you guys know, or at least already know this, but for the people who are new here, I want to make sense of like the realm of heaven and Angela and all that stuff, right? So the idea here is that the character of Angela was originally part of the Spawn mythos out in Image Comics for the longest time. But what ended up happening is through a series of rights ownerships and all kinds of stuff, the character of Angela ended up coming over to Marvel because the guy who created her came over to Marvel. And so that basically meant that all the things he created came with him, because when it comes to like independent creators, their own creations are their own product. They belong directly to them and not anybody else, which is one of the reasons why you see a lot of major comic book creators write indie comics, because they maintain total ownership. But the way that Marvel played this out is they said that Angela was actually from a realm called Heaven, and it was the 10th realm instead of it being the 9 realms. But due to a conflict that had been held at a previous point in time, and what was basically a kind of armistice, so to speak, not really even a treaty, just essentially a ceasefire, that the 10th realm was cut off from the 9 realms, and it was allowed to just kind of live out there and do its own thing. But all that was covered in original sin. And so when this revelation came to pass, you ended up learning there was this great big huge realm out there, right? And it was called Heaven, and it had all these angels and all these people in it that nobody knew about, and that Angela is actually the sister of Thor. And so that's what Angela's talking about when she says, like, the angels of heaven were able to reassemble this thing. It's not perfect, it's not to its original state, but we did what we could. And so there's this really amazing moment, because remember, Thor and Angela haven't always seen eye to eye, and there's always been a bit of a conflict there between the two of them. But this is a massively respectful thing that Angela and the angels of heaven had done here, something they didn't even really have to do, because they don't view Odin the same way that they view Thor, right? They see Thor as somebody entirely different, and in a lot of ways far more honorable than Odin was. And that's why Angela says, like, I told you I would clean up your mess if I had to, regardless of what that mess happened to be, so consider it cleaned up. And initially he's like, I know it's just a hammer, like I know that's it, like it doesn't have the power that it had before, it's not Mjolnir as it's always been, which is a very important thing, right? It's not Mjolnir the way that it's been before, which means that Thor could use this, and in some situations it would be stronger, whereas in other situations it could be weaker where it would have been stronger. So things aren't necessarily the same. It's really a way for Marvel to kind of rework the nature of the hammer and under what conditions are the most conducive to use it. And so what ends up happening here is Thor's like, I know there's no power here, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm okay with that. And that's when Angela says, well, I mean, maybe, but honestly, I think it just depends on who wields it, don't you? And so ultimately Thor, you know, where he turns around, Angela's gone, and he's like, okay. And then he actually prays to Odin, and he says, Father, I know somewhere you can hear my prayer. I am just so lost. I can't see the path that you've laid out before me. And then he hears this voice that says, keep your eyes open, boy. And then it goes to the hammer and it says, a king cannot rule from his knees. And so in essence, what it looks like here, and I could be wrong, we won't know until we get to the epilogue, but what it looks like here is the spirit of Odin, if you can call it that, Odin without the Odin force, I don't really know what that is, but the spirit of Odin is now encased inside the hammer. Whether that's true, I don't know. But if that is the case, this is a wholly different situation now, and no idea where in the world this even goes. I have no clue. But having said that, I absolutely love this. God, this was a ridiculously good Thor story. I love it when like writers come along and shift things up, change things around. It keeps it from growing stale, right? It keeps it from getting boring, right? Because after a while, it's like, well, here comes Thor with Mjolnir, whatever. But like, I love that this is being changed up. I find it absolutely awesome and refreshing. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. We'll probably make a full story out of this, don't worry. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.